Hello, everyone. This is sort of my second attempt at this particular response video. I woke up this morning to a video from the Distributist titled PSA, I'm not one of the good ones. And I was a little shocked, actually. So I'm sort of responding kind of off the cuff here. As you can see, I've moved, and I still haven't even finished setting like anything up. So I actually had to go like down into my new basement and dig all of my audio equipment out, and I couldn't find like half of it. So, I'm kind of doing this a little off the cuff, but I'm doing it because, one, I want to strike while the iron is hot here. I feel like with the Distributist putting out that video, he misrepresented me in a number of ways. I don't know necessarily that he intended to, but there were a lot of misconceptions in that video and a lot of things that I feel I need to correct. So I'm going to be doing that. This is mainly a quick live off-the-cuff response video before I go to work. All right, so first of all, this whole thing, if you're just getting involved in the kerfluffle, I actually do recommend that you go. The link to his video is in the description. You should watch it and make sure that, I'm not taking him out of context, or just point out, because, I get things wrong sometimes too. Rarely, but sometimes. Anyway, this whole thing went back to a Twitter argument that I didn't even think was going to be an argument at the beginning. He had put out a call, say, I'm not quite sure how to feel about this El Paso shooting, and I responded. I responded in good faith to what he had said. He seems to have accused me of concern trolling, which absolutely is not the case. I don't have time to concern troll. Like, I barely have time to record this video, and actually I even took up important time from my workday to respond to him and a few other people, because I feel like this whole dialogue around the El Paso shooting and around kind of the rise of the far-right terrorist is something that needs to happen. So, overall, like, I actually kind of feel a little ambushed here, especially since we have had great interactions in the past. I think he's a smart guy. I think he actually thinks about a lot of these things, which is very, very rare for most people. But there's a lot of things that I'm noticing in the video that are either a misrepresentation of what I had to say or a mischaracterization of, I think, a lot of the facts of the narrative that is expanding around this. So first of all, my tweet was essentially along the lines of, stuff like the El Paso shooting. This is what happens when you demonize immigrants and, minorities and fascists. They start crawling out of the woodwork and murdering people left and right, because that is really what's happening here. And I want to make this clear, because he sort of accused me of responding against peaceful Christian communities. I'm not talking about any of that, dude. I'm talking about fascists. I'm talking about Nazis. I'm talking about people like the El Paso shooter, who was radicalized online, who put out an entire manifesto. I am killing these people. I am killing these people because I am a white nationalist and I don't believe in race mixing. And I'm going to drive 600 plus miles down to a part of Texas where there is a Walmart that I know will have a large percentage of Hispanic and white people shopping at it. And that is why I am attacking, because I am against this idea of race mixing. To equate that with peaceful Christian communities or peaceful right-wing communities is completely ridiculous. If I didn't know this guy, if I hadn't, been on a stream with him before, I would actually think, nothing else involved, that he was being, that he was not engaging in good faith. And that what he was trying to do was hide behind these peaceful right-wing communities just to extol violence. But again, I don't think that's what the Distributist is doing, because I don't think he's a violent guy. He's never given me that inclination. What I think is actually happening here, and it oddly enough mirrors a little bit of something that I went through when I first got involved with Occupy Wall Street. All right, so essentially, he called me a progressive in the video. I wouldn't really consider myself a progressive, largely because progressive has a very specific connotation to it, sort of Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren type. That's not me. Though I actually do like them more than pretty much any other candidate at the moment. There is a history of the progressive movement in the United States that I don't share. Ideologically. I have identified in the past as an anarchist, as a left libertarian, and as an anarcho-communist. These are people could vaguely consider them. Like, I can see why someone on the right might consider that a progressive ideology, but really that doesn't fit the way I like to think about it. I don't even like to think about myself as being on the left. Like, a lot of my opinions, the fact that I advocate for socialism, the fact that I will go as far as to advocate for communism, though probably not the communism that or socialism that most people understand, that has, that has less to do with why I would identify myself as a progressive or a liberal or a leftist. I actually broke with the left publicly a number of years ago. I think it was as far back as 2015. And I did it specifically because of the bias that I'm seeing possibly in the Distributists' view on this tragedy. I split with the left not because we necessarily disagree on a lot of things, but because I don't want team mentality messing with my own mind. I don't want someone else's ideas or like just coming in and pulling me in with in-group bias and getting me to think in a way that I wouldn't otherwise do. And I really think that's what's happening with the Distributist here. I don't know why he has kind of included fascists, and I use the phrase fascists and bigots in his community. I certainly wouldn't include those in his community, at least from what I've seen, because if he had fascists and bigots, like, I would not be talking with him, plain and simple. So I think he may be reading in and extrapolating some things from what I've said, but the point is, there was a period when I was heavily involved with Occupy Wall Street. I joined OWS. I remember I became an anarchist around 2010. And it was a combination of living in New York City, seeing the massive wealth disparity because I'm an artist and I run in artistic circles. And because we have to attract wealthy patrons, that means I am rubbing shoulders with some of the elites in New York. And with a few notable exceptions, the elites drove me absolutely crazy. But when you kind of see that level of wealth disparity, and you see the institution that is New York City, with all of its massive buildings and billions of dollars running through the city every day, there is a very visceral reaction that people from a upper middle class background like myself would have. I mean, my family was working class. My grandfather drove a bakery truck. My father, we sort of climbed from there. My father's a doctor, a very successful one, and I'm an artist. My brother's an engineer. But the point is that the values that I had growing up are vastly out of sync with the values that I saw from the upper class in New York, and just kind of the world that a lot of them lived in, which was ridiculous, in my personal opinion. So you combine that with, economic worries and I remember I saw a chart that was like, where wealth is, where Americans think it is, where they want it to be, and just the sheer disparity between like the 1% and the 99%, it blew my mind. And at that point, I remember just kind of throwing up my hands in the air and going, fuck it, property is theft. And, I sat by myself kind of as an arguing internet anarchist for, about a year and a half until Occupy showed up. And I, grabbed my sign. I actually wrote out a sign that said, I was declaiming like what I was saying so much back then. private ownership of vital industry is theft. I didn't even say property is theft because I didn't want to turn people off like that, but it was a big black and red sign on the other side. It said, class warfare, bring it. And I took it down to Occupy. And I expected to be like the far, far left of Occupy as a result, not realizing that it actually was an anarchist movement. And, you know, it was the liberals and the Champagne socialists who were kind of in the minority. Though they tried very, very hard to co-opt it. And that's kind of why Occupy Wall Street is not as big of a movement today as it could have been. I think if they had taken the money from Ben and Jerry's, if they had become a voter drive for the Democratic Party, that would have been it would have been it for the radical aspect of Occupy, but for the institutional credibility, Occupy could have been a MoveOn.org kind of organization. It could have been the left's answer to the Tea Party, but it wasn't, because a lot of us refused to allow ourselves to be bought. Now the thing is that there was a lot of messed up stuff about Occupy. I'm not going to get into a lot of it because the press was so focused on smearing us at the time that there was almost this instinctive need to protect the movement, this instinctive need to make sure that we countered that narrative and that we didn't play into that narrative, because the press was so ridiculously focused on trying to destroy Occupy at every opportunity. And when I say that, I don't just mean editorial bias. I mean the Bloomberg called the head of the New York Times and before he was going to raid Zuccotti Park and said, I'm going to do this. Will you take my side? And the head of the New York Times said, absolutely, I'll take your side, Mr. Mayor. And, then they sent in the police and they deployed attack helicopters, police helicopters, to prevent coverage from the air. And they beat up journalists and dragged my friends out of their beds. And, in the middle of the night, all in all, it was a huge shit show. And so while I was in that environment and in that headspace and realizing the culture is saying this and people are getting so many wrong, bad ideas about us, can you see where this is possibly going here? I won't say that I ever lied for the movement, because my personal integrity matters more to me than that. But there were times that I was overly defensive of certain people and certain things within the movement than I should have been. And I didn't have my eyes open. And it was because I was okay, we're on a team here. And there is something very important that I need to make sure gets expressed to the rest of society that is currently being suppressed. I think that headspace may be a little bit where the Distributist is at this point, because he starts talking about the problem here was that the shooter was white. No, the problem is not that the shooter was white. The problem is the shooter was a Nazi who wrote a manifesto who said, I'm doing this because I hate race mixing. The Dayton shooter was white too. But the Dayton shooter, and I believe he actually was also mad about race mixing. I'm not sure because I haven't seen 100% confirmation on that. And the Dayton police said they were not investigating it as a bias crime. So I want to get that out there. But, the Dayton shooter apparently was Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders fan, as opposed to a Trump fan. That doesn't mean he did it because he likes Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, because then he would have shot up an Elizabeth, he would have actually gone looking for acceptable political targets there. And instead he killed his sister and her boyfriend and a bunch of people that just happened to be around there, because I think he had more in common with an incel than anything explicitly political, like the fascist shooter in El Paso, like the fascist shooter in Christchurch, like the fascist stabber in Portland, like the fascist who murdered Heather Heyer, or however you say that. I've heard it both ways. My point is that sometimes we build an imagined community around ourselves. And we do it not because we actually have any communal bonds with people. Like, I don't think the Distributist is going to the same church as the El Paso shooter. I don't think they frequent the same message boards. I don't think they're in contact with each other. That's ridiculous. He's not part of his community. What he is he's a guy who shares adjacent views, we'll say at times. And I think the Distributist, and he may correct me on this, was trying to essentially say, I don't want to throw my people under the bus because of this jackass. And the thing is, no one's asking you to do that. I certainly was not. Now, maybe someone else in your comments is, but that is not my intention when it came to responding about fascism and like how fascists are increasing their terroristic activities. It's very important, and I said this before when I was on RT, fascism is not really a right or left thing. Fascism is a fascist thing, and fascists will say or do whatever to get themselves accepted and to earn themselves power. I have studied fascists for years. Longer than pretty much anyone. Most of the people on the alt-right who became fascists know less about fascism than I do. And it's because I would say circa, probably 2010, I started writing a play set in the Spanish Civil War. It's part of the reason why I jumped headfirst into anarchism, part of the reason I went down to Occupy. There were personal reasons for it and political reasons, but also I wanted to be able to write a story about anarchists. And in working to try to understand anarchists, you have to also understand fascists. So I'm going to say right off the bat that the idea that the Distributist has to defend his community from criticisms of fascists. Maybe some bigotry gets spread in his community. I didn't see it. Maybe he feels a little guilty. Maybe he's said a few things that he is rethinking at the moment and just isn't ready to confront, but I'm not going to sit here and psychoanalyze him over that. My point, however, is that the community that he thinks exists does not exist. And in fact, you see it very quickly when the right and also the left, but when these big, broad political movements that are not based on any kind of community, but are based on the perception of shared ideas get together and they savage each other. It's because these people were never actually aligned. They think they should be aligned. And so they create this mental idea of a collective. They create this mental idea of, I'm owed this from you and you're owed this from me because we believe the same thing. I don't think the Distributist and the El Paso shooter believe the same thing. I don't think any Catholics who, maybe a little more nationalistic than I think is wise, believe the same thing. I don't think, especially when you consider that canonical penalties were proposed for ICE agents who separate families. I mean, the Catholic Church has been pretty clear on how it feels about what Trump is doing with immigration. And again, there may be, dissident Catholic communities that don't agree with it. I think that's extremely wrongheaded because it wasn't too long ago that Catholics themselves were the dirty immigrants that were to be hated and despised as papists. And it won't take too long to go back to that, the more power the fascists get. That's another weird thing about fascism. It is an ever shrinking circle of an in crowd, where someone is more pure than you. Leftists do it in the sense of ideology, where we call it the oppression Olympics, where the purity spiral shrinks and shrinks and shrinks until there's one tiny person who's the single most put upon person on the planet at the center of it, pointing at everyone saying, you're the reason for my problems. Now, the same thing happens with fascists, except it tends to be, one, race-based, and two, it tends to lead to murder and extermination, because murder and extermination is inherently baked into the fascist worldview. When you have an idea, when you base your entire ideology on an us versus them, and you say that my people We are the elite people. We are the important people. We are the ones who should rule over others. And we need to separation from, the phrase I've seen expressed, ethnic filth. What happens is that, again, is a negative cycle that repeats and gets more and more ridiculous until everybody but one human being is dead or someone stops you. This, I think, comes down to a number of the ways that fascists organize, largely that their movements are based on hate and othering, and creating an in-group in opposition to an out-group. You see it on the left as well in terms of solidarity, where people will say, oh, I'm oppressed, you're oppressed, we should be oppressed together, we should present a front because we have we have our oppression in common, and therefore let's go fight these other people. Yeah, there are sometimes that's valid, and sometimes that's really just hate. And you have to be very careful not to get sucked into it. So all in all, kind of what I want to say to the Distributist over this is, I really wish you'd taken the time to talk to me as a person and not as a representative of some strange movement that you think is out to troll you. And secondly, the other thing that I want to say to him is I want him to really consider if these people he thinks are his community are actually his community, because I don't think they are. I understand and I sympathize with the idea that you want to protect your community from slander, because you know that the media will somewhat associate your community with the actions of this other person. But at the same time, you don't want to defend that other person who you don't know and doesn't actually have any connection to any of your ideals beyond, at best, lip service. So those are two of the major things that I wanted to get into. The other thing that I kind of wanted to talk about towards the end of this video was he brought up this tweet, and it was a really weird tweet from Coastal Elite 22. And I looked up this account and couldn't find the tweet, which means that account either deleted it or it's not a real tweet, it's been edited. But it talked about, it was supposedly the tweet from the perspective of a mother of two white boys and how she despises her sons to a certain extent because they don't realize their privilege. Now, I'm not going to say this person doesn't exist, because there's always, no matter how crazy, you will always find somebody who pose law. You can't tell if this is a parody. You can't tell if this is a fake post. You can't tell if this is a fake account. I looked at the account and it seems to only retweet stuff. It has a lot of followers. But again, it didn't even have these tweets. But my point on bringing it up is I find that those three tweets very suspect because of the language they use. Whoever wrote those tweets does not actually move in leftist circles, whether they actually believe this stuff or not, whether they're a nut that despises their own children for being white and not figuring out about certain advantages, supposedly. That was not the language that a leftist would use to describe that. That was the language that a right-wing person might use to describe a bad impression of a leftist. Now, again, could be a real person. I don't know. I'm definitely very skeptical. But the reason I bring it up is, again, he talked about this video at the beginning of the video with the idea that it is white people that are under attack. And I will say there has been criticism of white people and whiteness, and some of it good criticism, some of it, idiotic. So I'm not going to say that perception is not invalid. I actually had a great talk with Todd Lewis of the In Praise of Folly podcast about we were talking about religion. Actually, it's a really nice live stream where we talk about Buddhism and Christianity, and it's a very nice kind of interfaith dialogue. But he talked about bigotry towards Christians that comes from the left. And, you know, I personally have found that Christians, like their Messiah, tend to really like the idea of being put upon by society. But at the same time, yeah, there is a lot of bigotry that comes from the left towards Christians. And there's a lot of people that think they know what Christianity is about. And they really have a, I guess, what's the word? They have a very cartoonish view of what it is. I think a lot of it stems from the new atheists. I think Christopher Hitchens in particular, as much as I used to like him, and I still kind of like aspects of his rhetoric, he really was not fair. And he never steel-manned his opposition. He would always go for the straw man. So I think that, you know, we need to be sure to always be approaching these dialogues about race and about identity with compassion, because a person is not their race. A person is not their identity. A person is not even their ideology necessarily. Ideology is adopted for a number of reasons, and political labels are adopted for a number of reasons. The Distributist calls himself a reactionary. He calls himself a traditionalist. He calls himself a Catholic. At no point have I ever heard him call himself a bigot or a fascist, and I don't consider him to be a bigot or a fascist. I do consider fascists to be a subset of reactionaries, but again, not the same thing. So all in all, what we have to do is we really have to come back to the idea that the people across the aisle, the people from another tribe, are people. They absolutely are people. And we should temper our criticism, because I don't want my son's a young white male, you know? He is growing up in a world where white males are more and more criticized than we have been in the past. He's also growing up in a world where white males have some unfair advantages, but everyone has unfair advantages. You know, everyone's karma plays out differently, and we're all dealt a hand that we have to play. So what I would say is, again, temper any criticism with compassion. And when we find ourselves getting at loggerheads because tribe A is saying nasty things about tribe B, you know, let's all remember that we're people. And I think that that's sort of where I want to end this discussion for now. And I'll just say, you know, I would highly recommend you check out the Distributist. I would also recommend that the Distributist maybe take a bit of a longer look at himself and make sure that what he is defending is actually his community, or if it's just an idea. And I contend that it's just an idea in the case of this tweet.